Hello, my name is Bret. This is my show. It's the holidays, so we're just going to do Q&A. Keep it simple. Talk about whatever you want to talk about. Answer your questions. If you're new to this show, I'm here every Thursday talking about Docker, talking about Kubernetes, anything containers, anything cloud native, mostly containers. So I am in Missouri with my family, and we're going to open up some gifts in a couple of days. So if you celebrate Christmas, Merry Christmas. I'm adorned with all of the things. There's a stocking hung in the background in the office. I don't know why, but it's in the office. And I've got maybe some hot cocoa or some coffee or maybe both with my Christmas mug. Let's answer some questions. Happy holidays, everyone. I'm gonna let's see if I can say Sigazupun. Pone. What's up? Hello, Biker. Hello, Troy. Sabin. And I guess we'll just get right in. But right before we do that, let me just give you some announcements real quick. Of course, if you've been here any time before, you've heard me talk about the Patreon. Thank you so much to all my patrons, all 100 plus of you that support this show and the podcast. Mentioning the podcast actually is over here. So if you go to bretfisher.com/podcast, links in the description. This show, an edited version of this show, is getting put now back into a podcast. We're back on the podcast this year. So it's doing really well. We actually, we're over 10,000 downloads a month on that. So thank you to all of you that are giving a rating or review of that podcast, as well as a thumbs up in this show, because that always helps. That always means a lot. And thank you for the thumbs up. I see that already. So I really appreciate it. All right. So I've been working on all sorts of stuff all year long. We did our sort of end of year show last week with Laura Taco, and we just talked about the tech we were interested in this year, what we're interested in next year. So go back to next week's episode here on YouTube if you want to go check that out and see what we talked about. Biker's up with the first question, though. Let's just dive in. They're using Traffic commercial for our website hosting, and we need a separate inactive DR cluster, but Traffic wants to charge a full additional license. Is this the functionality of the open source version comparable to the licensed version, except no support? So, well, first off, I'm just going to say it's a shame that Traffic doesn't either have a reduced cost or a no-cost DR solution, because that is what I'm used to, and you probably are too, in the infrastructure space, especially on-prem or a data center. Usually, like virtualization clusters. I remember 20 years ago, SharePoint clusters. We had data centers with SharePoint clusters, and we were able to basically read between the lines of the licenses and say that it's not active, it's not used by anyone, so it's not really in production mode, and we would be able to avoid the license fee. So I'm not an expert, but I do believe that the core functionality that is in the paid version, and I might be a little dated on this, is the redundancy in cluster. So to my knowledge, in the open source version, there's not an easy way for you to have multiple backend storage systems for all of the different rules and whatnot, so that you can make sure that if any part of your cluster goes down, there's zero hiccup. I believe that some of that's better or more automated and easier to do and more redundant by default in the production version. And I hope that I'm right. There's actually a Traffic channel in our DevOps. There might be some people in there that, over here in the DevOps.fan in our Discord server, there's a Traffic channel. I'm technically a Traffic ambassador, but I don't actually know the differences of the paid version. Back in the 1.0 days, that was the difference for me, especially with Swarm, was that it was basically, actually that might have been when they changed to 2. That might be remembering this as I go. We went from version 1 to version 2. I think a lot of the redundancy features became paid offerings, and those of us left to open source were limited to, basically hoping that Kubernetes gets the new pod back up quickly, and that there wasn't sort of a back-end sync of all the pods. That is my limited understanding. So hopefully going to be the right answer. Hello, Paul. Philip, our front-end devs run npm locally and not in Docker while developing. Should they use Docker instead? We deploy to Kubernetes. Um, this is a culture challenge because I myself don't always run everything in a container, especially when I'm just downloading a repo that's not built for a container and for developing in a container. And I don't want to have to make a compose file or in the ways of Visual Studio Code, if that's your editor, using a dev container, which allows you to sort of create a configuration in VS Code that basically everyone will run, and it has all your stuff in the container already. Because just like my Docker for Node.js course and the repo, Node.js, like other scripting languages, can be more complex to run in a container. And there's more pieces that you have to worry about, right? Where do you put the npm dependencies, the modules? Do you put that in a volume? Do you bind mount that and suffer the performance problem? So ironically, in my Docker for Node.js course, I tend to show you multiple ways. And then I don't think I did this in the course, but I actually had a talk or someone on that we talked about npm, and I just said basically, or not. Like maybe you don't do it in a container. And I think at the end of the day, if your developers have an automated testing pipeline, and this is anything, whether it's Node or PHP or Golang or whatever, the goal around local use of Docker is a couple of things. One is it solves your dependency problem in a much easier way than before. So you could argue that developers in your team are not required to use Docker for running the actual Node app that they're changing or editing, right? But they do use Docker, ideally Docker Compose, to run all the dependencies. So maybe they're developing on the front end, but there's an API backend, a database, and a Redis queue, and you need all that infrastructure stuff. So maybe you run all that in Compose, and then you just run npm directly for non-container development of your Node.js app. I see teams doing that. I'm not going to give you my preferred stance because quite honestly, I use them all. It just depends on the project, depends on the complexity. Simple projects, I can easily just spin it up and then just run a Postgres database with Compose, and I'm just developing locally. More complex projects that already have a Compose file where it's bind mounting in all the things, it seeds the database for me, it does all this stuff through automation in Compose, I will probably default to using Docker Compose for my Node.js development where the app is running in a container. The thing about Node.js, like PHP and others, is that it can run on every OS. So ideally, your dependencies all install the same way, you hope, on Mac or Linux or Windows. Doesn't always work out that way. But I think we're all evolving to the point that most developers now understand at least the basics of Docker, and they're able to make their own choice. So I'm going to go back to my original 2 minutes ago thing of basically if you have really good testing, and by I mean really good, let's say at least 80% coverage, you're automating the testing on each commit that you push to GitHub, and that you're giving the developers local tools like an easy Docker one-liner to run all the tests inside the local container so that basically they're developing locally, but if they want to do a test run like an npm test, then they're doing that from inside the container because the tests will then run on the exact build environment, including any host dependencies, the kernel, like all the things of Linux. And so that if the testing is passing and you have solid test coverage, then you can feel more confident that the developer is not developing in Docker, they're developing native on their Mac or Windows machine, that those people aren't going to get in trouble when the code is pushed to production and it fails. So it's really, to me, it's about automation and test coverage. If you can really ramp that up, then it frees your developers to not be so, I'm going to say paranoid, so concerned about their developer environment being identical to production. Because there's always going to be variances, right? I've seen before people locally developing on Postgres, and in production, they're using AWS Postgres and it's slightly different, or there's different memory settings or whatever in production, and there's different reservations, and things aren't always the same in production, so they end up in the production problem that they didn't experience in dev because of infrastructure changes, ever so slight, right? So we're always trying to get to that utopia, but I'm just realizing my mic's a little hot. I'll turn that down. Yeah. So hopefully that answered that question. That's a great question. All right, who's up next? Pushad. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I'm using Nginx with PHP. I'm running Docker Compose and would like to have my application logs show up in the container logs next to the Nginx request. Is this possible? They are log files. So, all right, so are you using, I'm using Nginx with PHP. Are you using Nginx and PHP in the same container? So every container's logs should be going to standard out and standard error, right? So if you're following that rule, which you should be, then each container is getting dumped to its own, technically in Docker, it's dumping into a JSON file per container. And then each container, you can redirect those logs. You can tell Docker, no, I don't want these in the JSON file so I can use Docker logs command. I actually want to ship it to a centralized logging solution. And sometimes I even, especially on a microservice app, I might run a local logging setup, like an Elasticsearch setup, so that all of my logs in my compose file are sent to that. And then I get to use that search console, the web GUI, to search for files and errors and stuff, search through all the files at once. So in microservice projects where I've got dozens of containers and I want to run them all at the same time, I will often do that. I'll have actually a separate compose file that has that set up. Or nowadays with Compose, you can use a profile. Compose has a newer feature where I can set the logging solution as its own services, but they're set to a specific profile. If you go back earlier this year, by the way, I have different Compose videos. Like there's one video from earlier this year on YouTube called Compose V2. Goes through all those new features, and I show off how the services can be used so you can spin up various things. So anyway, that's an idea. You don't have to do that. But your original question around, is this possible? I would say not if they're in separate containers. If they're in the same container, then they should just show up together, right? When you're using Docker Compose, though, and you use a Docker Compose logs command, you see all the logs combined and colorized. That's one of the bigger advantages of using Compose. It's one of the reasons I always say, always use Compose for local development, because it's going to help solve that. There is no Docker logs command to combine multiple containers, but Docker Compose logs does do that, and it also will colorize them, and it timestamps them so you can see them all together. You can technically do a Docker Compose logs command and then specify multiple containers. I could be wrong, but let me see. Let's go look there. Someone show in chat if you already know the answer to this. So Docker Compose logs, and I believe you could do two services. So you could do, web API. That might work. Try it out. Let me know. Again, Discord server right above me, DevOps.fan. You can go there and ping me in the general channel or the Docker channel, whatever, if you're having problems with that. But that's the way I would do it. Hopefully that helps. All right. Biker's back. It seems like Docker Desktop using Kubernetes is now much more efficient than earlier versions, so it is viable as a development environment versus Docker Compose. I like to be the same as production. Honestly, I'm still not a fan. I mean, you could tell me that Kubernetes takes up no resources on my computer, and I'm not, unless you have to adopt other tools for Kubernetes to help it build development environments and manage development environments, I'm not necessarily a fan. I feel like the simplicity of Compose and the Compose workflow is focused around all the commands you need to use locally. But the minute you want to use kube control directly, none of that's ideal. There's not easy commands. They're not as easy in Kubernetes. They're getting better, but they're not as easy in Kubernetes. And the workflow in Kubernetes is not designed for a local developer. So again, to me, this comes down to testing. If people are not comfortable developing in Compose while Kubernetes manages their infrastructure, then you should have Compose, at least the most basic thing is in your automated testing. It's not hard to set up a workflow that spins up right, Kubernetes and Docker, or something else, right? Mini K8s or micro K8s, which I really don't use that at all in CI, or keys, K3s, right? Some of these smaller distributions, but Kind is the project that the Kubernetes team designed to be able to automate their own testing of Kubernetes in Kubernetes. So we should feel comfortable using Kind as a way to spin up clusters. And what I consider bare minimum is that your automated testing for every single commit in a PR should be able to spin up a Kind cluster really quickly, test that app in Kubernetes with its health check. So essentially what the workflow looks like is that you make a commit, it takes your production or your infrastructure Helm chart or Kubernetes manifest or customized manifest or whatever you want. It's using Kind and spinning up a cluster. It only takes a minute to do this. Spins up the cluster and waits for that app's health check to pass. And then once the health check is true and good, it will tear it all down and consider it good. Because that's like a lot of common problems in that workflow, in that pipeline are not, they're not unique little apps, app bugs that only show themselves in Kubernetes infrastructure, right? They're usually things related to, our endpoint changed for health checks, so the probe fails, or someone didn't set an environment variable, or someone added a new environment variable that we didn't set, or someone forgot, changed the name of an environment variable and didn't go into the Helm chart. I see those kind of infrastructure and YAML changes breaking production when everyone tested the app just fine, right? Because assuming you have unit tests and some other more advanced tests for your code, that all shows up in development and in CI. This is now running in Kubernetes and that doesn't work in Kubernetes. That's the problem I'm trying to solve here, right? So I'm going to set up Kind in that workflow and it's going to pass the health check, or the PR will not get merged and so if that PR requires an infrastructure change, then we're going to have to also have another PR in whatever that Helm chart repo is that coincides with my app code. So that's going to have to happen whether or not I'm developing in Kubernetes. Because one of the realities of developing Kubernetes locally is that it's going to be quite different than your production infrastructure. It's not going to be able to use the load balancers probably. It's certainly not going to be able to use, you're probably not going to have the same ingress setup because you're probably using more infrastructure in the cloud. You're not going to be using the same storage drivers. It just goes on, right? Like you probably have more advanced network policies in production than, you can't even use a lot of that locally with Docker Desktop because Docker Desktop Kubernetes doesn't support, I don't believe it supports other third-party networking drivers. The list of things that are going to be quite different for your local development are huge. So I know that there's things like Scaffold and all these other tools that help you do that, but I'm still not convinced that solves some magical big problem that we would have if we're using Compose locally. Almost without exception, every team I've worked with still uses Compose locally, Kubernetes in the cluster. What most of those teams are not doing yet is testing in Kubernetes. And so that's what I'm advocating for, is to solve this problem through Kind automated testing. So hopefully that helps. That's my 2 cents. It's just my preference. Ooh, sudo B Mitch is here. Hello. Change the log of your the log file of your PHP app to dev as standard out. Yeah, great recommendation. And that's what you should be doing on all your apps, right? Is sending them to standard out. Yep, perfect. All right, I'm just catching up on that chat. Hello, Nadir. We're exploring using multi-stage Docker files with that. The line is getting blurry between local development and deployment. What are your thoughts on having a local dev stage and Docker file? Absolutely. So if you look, I have examples of this. So if you go, I'll pull this up real quick. It's not dated. It's just, I maybe have a more advanced real world multi-stage setup, but on github.com, Bret Fisher, DockerCon 19. In this repo, I'll throw this in chat. So Nadir, to your question, in here I have maybe this one, So I teach this. You can watch the talk there, but it goes through all these. And there's a bunch of multi-stage here. And so I have a stage that runs tests. I have a stage that's focused on development. And then I have a stage that's production. The art of all this is that I build production first in the early stages, and then I layer on top of that dev tools or testing tools, which are often the same, right? You need your artifacts, your tests, right? You need all that stuff there. You might need some seed data in the database that's used for testing. So I have all of that, maybe minus the seed data, because you can't really seed a database from inside a Docker file, or at least you shouldn't. But you can see here that I have, like, this is the dev. So up at the base, I'm setting up all the stuff that every one of these stages will use. Then I'm creating a dev stage, and you'll see here where I'm doing like an npm install of the development stuff. And then the source, I'm copying in all the source, and this particular example is a little different, because what I'm basically doing is, my attitude is, in development, you're bind mounting your code and all your dependencies in this particular file. So I'm not even copying in code for development, because why? If I'm going to bind mount the code in, why do I need the code in the image at all, right? So for testing, we add more stuff in. We do more things that are specific to testing, and in this example, I actually run the tests as the default command, right? Or actually, I run them here, and then I'm not sure why I'm having run tests there. If you watch the talk, I kind of walk through it, but it's at this point 2 years old, over 2.5 years old, so I'm a little fuzzy on my details. But this is, as you can imagine, this is kind of what I'm doing. And I even built another optional stage for scanning. You might not do this all, the testing automation and the scanning. You might not do that in Docker build. You might do that in your CI. I tend to nowadays, especially with GitHub Actions, I tend to prefer doing a lot of that automation in GitHub itself rather than a Docker build. And that's primarily so that I can see each of the steps in GitHub Actions. Whereas if you do it all here, it's all just going to be in that one Docker build step. A lot of CI platforms aren't looking into Docker build yet and actually extracting out each of the layers and each of the commands. I wish they did. That would be really cool. And we could rely on a Docker file as more of the CI infrastructure. But you can get my point here. Is absolutely, yes, I'm agreeing with you. Experiment with this. I tend to get a little fanatical, so my Docker files tend to be 200 plus lines because, well, for things like Node and PHP and apps that require it, a Golang is going to be way shorter, but these other ones that, PHP is a great example, right? You might have apt-get dependencies, you might have PHP dependencies, and you might even have some npm dependencies. So now you're running all three commands, and it layers them all on top, and it gets rather complex. So my end goal in all this is to try and have the same code and the same production dependencies in all the layers. What I don't want to do is I don't want to have it test my container and then rebuild it and reinstall everything for production. Because we all like to think that we're pinning every version of every dependency and everything on the computer, but it's really hard and it's really rare for me to see everyone doing that. Like everyone pinning every possible dependency. So the reason that we want to do all that is installing production dependencies and production code first before we test is because we want those exact production dependencies. Once they're approved through the testing system, we want that exact binary, SHA-hashed unique layer to be the exact same one we go to production with. And if I have to rebuild it all, and it's going to change, possibly even in just a bit layer of change, I can't guarantee that production is exactly the same way as my testing. So I tend to make a more complicated file like I'm showing here, where I'm installing all the production stuff, and then there's other stages that are optional, and I might target a specific stage for development, target a different stage for testing, and then target a third stage for production. Hopefully that helps. Happy holidays. So hopefully that helps, Nadir. All right. Bitmonkey. Bitmonkey says, I have the impression that Kubernetes is still way too complicated for most of the devs out there. I would like to think beyond K8s. What do you think is the next big thing? I think we're very far away from anything that's post Kubernetes. You can't say serverless because serverless requires greenfield. Greenfield. You have to develop from scratch, or you're basically moving your logic out of your app into a function in most cases to use serverless. So I think the future is still everything in a container. I think the future of Kubernetes is that someone else will run it for you. So my recommendation is if you're running a bunch of stuff or if people are managing their own Kubernetes environments, you want to stop doing that. You want to get away from that and go towards all, Google Autopilot, all the Azure and AWS options for running containers without you manually building out Kubernetes, upgrading it manually with your own kube control commands. Like, you want to get away from that. And the clouds are all moving to where Kubernetes is self-automate, self-upgrading on its own if you choose to, providing push button deployments, push button types of upgrades, and adding and replacing nodes is trivial or just done for you automatically, just depending on which variant of the Kubernetes you're doing. So with every single company in this space investing in Kubernetes, and with every single one of them investing their add-ons, because this is really an ecosystem thing, right? This isn't just Kubernetes itself. This is all of the ecosystem tooling wrapped around it. They're all invested in Kubernetes. So someone would have to come up with something way better than Kubernetes, not just easier, but better, because the rest of the industry tends to follow the tip of the spear, and the tip of the spear is fully invested in Kubernetes. So you're going to have to get the smartest people, the brightest people, all these people from Google and Netflix and Amazon and Microsoft and GitHub and all these other people. You're going to have to get them to latch onto some other tool. And I think we're many, many years away from that. I think if anything, what we're seeing is Kubernetes is easier. It's easier to deploy. We've got newer additional resources. We've got new things like the pod security stuff changing so that we've got a more flexible policy for that. So I don't think at this point you can avoid it. I don't think you can avoid learning it. And I think that if you put your stake in the ground and say, I'm not going to learn Kubernetes and I'm going to find something else, what you will end up doing is you'll find a niche, right? Doesn't mean these tools aren't good. Doesn't mean they're not valid. But when you're forcing yourself to not use it or look at it, you're limiting yourself to all the other smaller, less popular options. And there's also this ecosystem problem, right? The people that you're hiring eventually, and maybe not right now, because we're all still kind of in the first decade of Kubernetes, but once everybody's learned it, at least the basic resources, and there's only maybe 8 or 9 or 10 resources that you really need to know. As a developer, there's probably only 5 to 6 you really need to know. So once you learn those, everything else is infrastructure, and that you should have an infrastructure team that's managing that, right? That's part of the role of ops, is to worry about redundant load balancer setup and network security policies and those more advanced things, and they should be helping you with that. If you're a smaller team and you don't have the resources for that, you don't have an ops person, you don't have a team that's dedicated to more of the infrastructure side of things, then that's where you look at things like, Heroku or Netlify, or these things that are they're in the fringe and they're not near as popular, but they might alleviate some of the pain. To me, though, I would still go after Kubernetes. I feel like if you're doing Google Autopilot or AWS's, at this point, I've lost count of how many things they have that use containers. But if you look at those other options, they might be easier for you. You don't have to manage the infrastructure. You just have to understand the YAML. And once you've written the YAML, it's largely just copy paste, right? So once you've done that the first time, whether it's a Helm chart or whatever, the hard work is done, and then you're just going to tweak it over time. So I'm sorry that I can't get you. I would love to say everybody just do Swarm, but the reality is that the industry's left Swarm behind. And so as much as we all love it, it still works. It's still great, but it's a rarity to find anyone using it in the real world in production nowadays. So people that have got it, it's usually because they installed it years ago and it still works. That's why I still teach it and still sell a course on it, because it's built in and a lot of the basic concepts are still the same as Kubernetes. But would I be implementing it as a brand new thing right now in 2022 to be the foundation of my infrastructure for the future? Probably not. No, I wouldn't do that. I would now invest in Kubernetes as that option, and it will be a project, but choose Fargate, right? Do AWS Fargate, do autopilot on GitHub. Sorry, Google, Google's autopilot, and those are going to alleviate a ton of the pain of infrastructure. Plus, all those things, they already make decisions around storage, networking, ingress, all the things. They have backups now that are built in. So you're getting so much of that out of the box. So why not use it? Ajay, what's up? I have recently taken your Docker course. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'm glad you think it's awesome content. Merry Christmas, James. Is there a way to use compose down with profile and only pull down those services with that profile? Up works as expected, but not the down. So if I would say that sounds like a bug. So yes, down with a dash profile should obey the profile. The compose team may feel differently, but if you don't see anything about this in the compose repo, file a bug. You can at me inside of your, file it and then mention me in your message in the post, in the comment, and I'll take a look. I'll mention it to the compose team and see if it's intentional. Then they're probably thinking, well, maybe you don't down with a profile, maybe you stop with a profile, right? So Docker compose stop. Well, yeah, Docker compose -- profile. I think the profile comes before the stop. I could be wrong. I'm just typing it. Yeah, so I think it's Docker compose -- profile, the name of the profile, stop, containers. Down deletes the containers, right? And a down -v would also delete the volumes. So I would expect the profile to work. And if you don't, file a bug, file a GitHub issue in github.com/docker/compose. Go there, file an issue, at me, I'll check it out. Robot Glock is back, Jenkins X. I haven't heard anything about it. I don't know anyone that uses it. I don't know even the status of the project. All the people that I know that used to work there, which was 4 or 5 people, they've all left. So I don't know anyone at Jenkins, at CloudBees, the company that runs Jenkins X. I don't know anyone that works there, so I don't really have a status on that. I just know that I don't see it. So I don't know anyone talking about it. But that could just be my worldview. That could just be the people I know, and I just don't know the right people. So if anyone has an update on Jenkins X, there's a repo. Go check out the repo, see the comments in the releases. Hopefully the releases have functionality. But Merry Christmas, Rodrigo. Yeah, make them do all the hard stuff. You're funny. I'm told that code in pods should be single-threaded and scaled is the pod level. If an API call is many operations, where can that be parallelized in K's world? So I wouldn't agree with that. I mean, you've got lots of applications that are built in. They have multi-thread built in. What I don't want you to do is to use a third-party tool or a module of some sort that sort of bolts on multi-threaded as an afterthought, rather than use if your language and your framework has built-in native multi-threading, then use that. So for example, in a Ruby app with Puma multi-threads it. Just set a standard in Puma. Maybe it's however many threads or workers. I'm trying to remember the term they use with Puma. That's a web server, right? So in that case, I would multi-thread it there. but I wouldn't use that as my point of scale. So when you think about this of how you scale in orchestration now, you can have multi-threads in your app in a container. But when you need more of them, when you need more threads, what you shouldn't do is go into the configuration of that image, or maybe it's an environment variable you set, don't go in there and change that and then redeploy. What you should be doing is scaling out the number of replicas of that deployment, right? So that's how you scale. So what I would probably do in my case, if it's something that's built in, if it's inherent to the language or framework or app that I'm using, then I will just set that to maybe 2 or 4 or 6. It just kind of depends on the workload and the scale and all that. But that's fixed. And I know that every single pod, every single container in that pod that's running that is going to be that many threads exactly. And I won't change it based on load. What I do change is the replicas in the deployment. So if we go to Christmas time and I'm still on because you can auto scale this, right? You can auto scale with Kubernetes and let it manage the number of pods running in your replica set. It's going to manage that based on metrics, and it can scale up and down. If you're not to that auto scale level yet, and that's fine, totally fine, then when you need more, you're going to go in and you're going to edit the YAML, the manifest. You're going to not the value of the number of threads. I want that to be fixed. And that way, no matter how many pods you have, you always know that they're all using the same number of resources. They're given the same number of connections, because your load balancer's making sure the connections are relatively consistent between all the pods. And you know the exact thread count. The problem that you want to get away from is having different variants. So if you changed a pod spec and you set some environment variables, and maybe you have a multi-redundant cluster set up, so maybe you've got one deployed over here in this cluster and one deployed over here, and you're load balancing across clusters. That's a pretty advanced scenario, but people do it all the time. Then you could potentially end up with one deployment that has 4 threads per pod and another one that has 8 threads per pod container, and you don't want that, right? So you want it very consistent. You also want that same thread count for testing and ideally for development. I tend to prefer, not assuming that it's not trying to take 800 megs of RAM or whatever by default. I will try to set those threads as the same in all of this stuff, because you want to eventually do testing of your performance. So when you're doing load testing, you want to make sure that you understand the threads and how they affect that. What's your memory requirements? What's your CPU requirements to handle that many threads? And so once you've tested that, that's what you put in production, and you lock it in place. You don't change that. You just change it via the number of replicas. So hopefully that helps. That's how I roll all this out. What I don't recommend is, for example, there's I'm going to forget. In Node-land, in Node.js, there are modules you can get that will enable, essentially in the background, spins up multiple node processes. I don't recommend that. I don't do that. If it's something where, again, it's built in and it's not some third-party module or some bolted-on thing on top of it, I will make sure that threading is enabled, because I get better performance and I get more CPU usage out of it. But if it's something where I'm bolting on, and someone's going to remember in chat, Node.js has a couple. One of them is it PS or PM or something like that, or P2, PM2 or something like that. And then I think there's a few other ones as well in the projects, the different module projects. But those I don't use, because all they're really doing is spinning up multiple node processes inside the same container. And the problem you have there is that, what if one of those has a problem? Kubernetes doesn't understand how to monitor every single one of those sub-processes. It only knows how to monitor the main process, or the PID1. And so you don't want a bunch of those sub-processes unless the thing was designed to do that from the beginning. For example, MySQL will create sub-processes. Nginx creates sub-processes, but they do it well. They build it into the code from day one. They know how that works. Because if you start to do things like PM2, then one of them goes bad or runs out of memory and the other one doesn't. How does Kubernetes know what to do, right? So it's going to be a little weird, because it might fail one health check and then pass another, because your health checks are technically being sent to different processes in the container. So it creates a big problem. I don't recommend it, but that's my opinion. Hopefully that helps. That's a great question. Naveen, what's up? In large production environments, LS migrate the big application like Confluence into Kubernetes is a good thing. Yeah, I don't believe that there's a workload that inherently I would never put into Kubernetes. I'm also not an AI machine learning guru. So, big data and some of those, I would say maybe not so much edge cases anymore, but some of those non-default workloads, they maybe have their own orchestrator still that maybe isn't really Kubernetes friendly today, but probably will be very soon if they're not already. But everything else, do it in a container. It works great in Kubernetes. Remember my golden rule? I say that a lot on this podcast. If the cloud provides it, use the cloud's thing. Don't run your own Postgres just because you can in Kubernetes. Ideally, you want the cloud to run it for you. They're way better at it. They're going to back it up, make it redundant, fault tolerant, all the things you care about. Better monitoring, better performance out of the gate. It's always going to have better ideal performance settings and tuning, and that you didn't tune in your Kubernetes because you maybe aren't the guru on the planet for that particular app. Always use the cloud's tools for persistent storage, particularly. Like that's what I really focus on is persistent storage stuff, databases, queues, anything like that. I try to use the cloud service. Not because it's not good in Kubernetes, it's just a lot more work. You gotta tune that thing. You gotta go find how to make that container run better, essentially faster, better than the default settings. So I try to avoid that work. Just use the cloud. All right, Robot Clock. I think multi-threading worker threads is enabled in Node natively in recent versions. Yeah, and that's what I'm talking about. Like if threading is built into the language framework, Node.js is the framework, right? And I knew that was coming. I mean, I haven't really paid attention to like 12, 14, and 16. But I knew that was coming, so that's why I'm giving that caveat. If it's starting to be a part of the native language and every install gets that feature, I'm all for it, because now the architects of the language are thinking in multi-thread when they do a lot of stuff. When they enable a lot of the functionality of the language and the framework. But if you bolt it on as a module, it tends to kind of not be as good. It just doesn't have the native integration that you would expect. So I don't recommend that, the bolt-on. James is saying I was always told not using databases of persistent data is not a good idea. I don't agree with that. And I have been running databases in production for well over 5 years in Kubernetes and Docker and Swarm, right? And all the things, containers. So the reason I don't agree with that is that I think where that came from, that opinion that you have, probably that you were taught, came from people that one of two things happened. It was very early days of containers, and we had certain performance problems. We had storage drivers. There's this thing in containers where it's called storage driver, and it has to do with layers. And nowadays we all tend to use overlay too, but it layers on the file system. And in certain scenarios, that's not as performant in reads versus writes. So there were long ago, I'm talking like 2016, 2017 days, there were some edge cases at times. Back even in I think it was 2017, I have on my website at bretfisher.com/Docker, there's a white paper there that I did with HP and Docker, and we basically built out this whole testing framework and compared the performance of databases in containers on bare metal, in containers in a VM versus no containers. And basically containers were the identical, and in some cases better performing than them running outside the container. The reason they were actually at that time better performing was because if I had a piece of hardware and I could use bare metal containers, what that allowed me to do was run 20 MySQL database containers all in the same host in bare metal without any virtualization. and I got to remove the layer of emulation that virtualization provides, that synthetic virtualization. And once you get rid of that, you get back a whole bunch of memory. It's less transactions that are having to hop across the OS boundary, and so we got a little bit better performance. So I would argue that containers might even enable better performance. The other reason for databases that people were hung up on was when people are relatively new to containers and they're relatively new to operating container clusters, which are not easy, right? It's not something you do in a month. There are concerns, right? You don't want to accidentally delete a volume of a database. You don't want to accidentally do something to a database like redeploy it without proper testing, so then it breaks your database. Those things are not any different or inherently more risky in a container than non-container. It's just more common to do that. Once we all got to container land, it was easier to update your MySQL version or your Postgres version. It was easier to move that from one node that went down and dynamically spin it up in another node with remote storage, maybe using, Fiber Channel or iSCSI or something else, right? So we started doing all those things, which at times made our databases less reliable because we didn't fully understand all the pieces to that puzzle. So I would argue that a lot of people were coming up against that problem, is they were having to relearn how to operate databases again because they're now doing it in a container and it's now hopping across hosts during failures, and they're now updating image versions and doing all that stuff. So every team that I've seen do this, by the way, they had to go through that learning process, which is why I just state, use the cloud if you can. Use the cloud's stuff. So hopefully that helps. Yeah, Sabine is saying doing storage as well is still really hard in Kubernetes. It depends on your database and storage options whether it'll be a good plan. Yeah, so if you're going to run databases on anything, whether it's a container or not, there's way more work for you than just using the cloud, right? You got to test your backups and test your restores. You got to have way better monitoring because you can't just rely on, is my MySQL connection working? You got to look at resource contention, and is the performance hitting the disk too much, or do I not, are my disks on a local server rather than remote where it's maybe slower? Do I need to use local SSDs and NVM, all this stuff that basically the cloud has worked out. So I would argue that it's really just about running databases yourself, and that's the core thing. So in my talks, even going back as far as 2017, 2016, when I would do talks about going production, I would always state databases in production are fine for containers, but it shouldn't be your first or second project. Really, it should probably be the last thing you migrate into containers, if you do that at all, right? If you're not going to use the clouds and you're going to put it in your own cluster, then you should be well versed in all the other parts running in your cluster first, because storage is always hard and databases are always hard. Putting them in Kubernetes means that you really have to know Kubernetes and containers and images and health checks and all the other parts of it. So I just recommend that people wait until they're really good at either Kubernetes or just let the cloud do it. All right, so we're coming up on an hour. I'm going to try to keep it to an hour this week, and we can all get back to preparing for the holidays. So what else you got? What other questions we got in chat? By the way, while we're here, I just want to mention next week, I'm going to do another show again myself. You let me know in chat or in the comments for the video what you'd like to see next week. So one of my thoughts for next week, and I don't know if I'm going to do this yet, but one of my thoughts for next week is it's the holidays for a lot of us. It's a couple days before New Year's. Hopefully you're getting that time off and a little downtime. You may be hopefully taking some vacation. And I love to learn new things on vacation when I get a chance. Of course, you've got family and all that stuff going on, but I rarely take time to learn new things. And one of the things I've wanted to do is you do the DigitalOcean's Kubernetes. Hold on, let me pull it up. Their Kubernetes challenge. So, but if this month DigitalOcean is offering a free Kubernetes challenge, And if you complete it, which basically you're going to be learning and using their Kubernetes offering, if you do it, you get to do basically good things for other people. You get to donate using their money to a project on Open Collective. And then you get a bunch of swag. So I'm thinking, let's all just come together next week. We get an hour, if we block out an hour of time, we can all hopefully do this together. Maybe we can finish it. I don't know if I'm actually going to do it beforehand to see. But this is what I was thinking. I was like, let's all give some free swag, and let's all see if we can give something to charity and actually do something good. So tell me what you think about that idea. Either give me a thumbs up as an indicator that's a good idea, because I see we're at 19 thumbs up. So if you like that, give me a thumbs up, or make a comment or something, and maybe we'll do something together. We'll actually work on a product together, and I'll walk through it, and then you guys can do it. So that's an idea for next week, but I don't have a guest. We're going to have guests starting again in January. And I also just want to mention, if you didn't remember me mentioning at the beginning about the podcast, that the podcast is back up and running again. You can find it in all the podcast players. If you don't find it in your podcast player, please let me know, because it's everywhere that I can find. And we've now been going through a bunch of our best back episodes and releasing those in edited form, where we cut it down, trim it down, and yeah, some of our best hits of the year, right? Docker Compose version 2, which is one of my favorite things. And just check those out. And I would love it if you would give me a rating or review on your podcast player of choice. That really, really helps to get this in front of more people, so more people can check it out. Kubernetes Challenge. All right, we got people liking that. Kubernetes Challenge. I dig it. I'm actually going to reach out to DigitalOcean and see if this is cool with them, and just to make sure that we can get all of the money and the stuff for everyone, and we'll see if we can do it in an hour. I'll go check it out. Ray's asking about book recommendations to study for the Docker cert. So it's funny you mentioned this and asking me about the Docker cert. I don't think you should do it. I don't think you should do the Docker DCA anymore. I'm a Docker captain, so I probably should not be saying that. But right now, the status of the Docker cert is that it's run by Mirantis, not Docker itself. And so it's actually kind of weird to me that they call it a DCA. If you look up Docker DCA, you'll find that this is on Mirantis' website, and they've changed this certification. And so it's not just about Docker. It's a little bit of Docker, a little bit of Swarm, a little bit of Kubernetes, and then it's about their paid distribution of Kubernetes. So it really should be called the Mirantis Certified Associate, not, or I think they call it the Mirantis, because Mirantis has their own distribution, and the Mirantis Kubernetes engine is their platform that used to be called Docker Enterprise, and that's what the test is really, I think, focused on nowadays. I haven't taken it since Docker gave it up and gave it to Mirantis. So my theory right now is that unless you're using the Mirantis platform, you don't want to go after the DCA, because it's just for that platform. So the funny thing is that someone's been asking this in the course. So I've been updating. There's a lecture in my course, Docker Mastery, that I'm updating with this revised opinion in 2021, 2022. So what I'm stating now is, unless you're using Mirantis, avoid the DCA, and then go after what I'm going to call the holy trilogy of DevOps certifications. Go after a DevOps specific certification like AWS DevOps, or one like the DevOps Institute, some of these out there that are more generic DevOps, and then get a Linux certification, because that's the OS that we're all using in the cloud nowadays. Yes, we still have Windows, but I think even for Windows people, it's hard to avoid Linux, so you might as well get the Linux certification now. And then get a Kubernetes certification. So go to the Linux Foundation's website, look up the CKA, CKAD. There's a security one. There's an associate one now, I think, that's related to the cloud native community. There's a bunch there. So go look up those. So the Trinity to me is Cloud, OS, Kubernetes. And if you get those three, I think that no one would state that those three are not more or less vital if you're trying to go for certifications. Now, I have over 30 certifications, but I don't have all those exactly. For example, I don't have a DevOps certification simply because I feel like I've been doing it forever. So not sure I need to prove myself with that certification. But if you are getting into this new, if you're trying to change your career, that's how certifications work, right? So in the first half of my career, I was getting certifications every year, which is how I got to over 30. But now that I've been doing this 25 or more years, I just don't get them that often. What I do now is I go after certification specifically because I want to know what it's like and be able to recommend it to students or advise students on it. So anyway, I would kind of turn it down, yeah. And Docker is recommending Udemy courses, yeah. Yeah, I've been lucky that Docker early on started recommending my course to their own employees. So I've been very grateful to them for doing that. And I appreciate it. Robot Glock's back. Are cloud IDEs like Cloud9 and now GitHub Spaces and VS Code Remote going to abstract away into the cloud the need for devs to use Docker Compose on their local dev machines? Great question. And that's probably a good topic that, one, I've covered that like 4 or 5 times this year already. I've been talking about code spaces, GitHub Actions, all things GitHub. So yes, I do think it will change things, but I don't think it's going to keep you from running Compose. Because a lot of those things, in order for you to spin up all the pieces of your app, you need some tool to do that, and that still is Compose. I have not yet seen in something like VS Code with Cloud Spaces, which, by the way, Cloud Spaces by default, it gives you Docker, but it doesn't give you Kubernetes, right? So you've got Docker, it already installs Compose for you. So when you spin up a code space, you have Docker and Compose right there in your VS Code editor, ready to go. And I love code spaces. I've been using code spaces so much this year that it's now my default for running x86 containers because I'm on a Mac M1. So I'm running ARM. And if I don't have an ARM image, I would probably rather just run it on Intel, which is what Cloud Spaces or Code Spaces gives you. So I tend to do that. The other advantage of Code Spaces that I really like is that I can use it on multiple machines and I can use it on my iPad. So I can kind of use whatever machine I have and I go into github.com/codespaces, which shows me all of my repos that have a code space. And then it even shows me what branch I'm on and whether I've made edits that I haven't committed. And it stores all those in each one of these isolated cloud storage solutions. So, and GitHub charges me cents a month to do that. So I now can basically be on whatever machine I'm on, my desktop, my laptop, my iPad, my phone, whatever, and I can go look, okay, what's the status of that PR? I remember I was working on that PR last week, so I go to that code space, I spin it right back up, it takes 30 seconds, and I look at my changes, and I don't have to say, what I don't have to do is then go find the computer that I did that pull request on because maybe I forgot to push the commits, right? So I just don't have to do that as much when I'm using code spaces. So, but I still use Compose. And I still use Docker, and it works really great with Compose. So I would still say doing that. I don't think it's going to change that tooling yet. Which DevOps certs would you recommend? I think, honestly, you get 2 for 1. If you go for the AWS DevOps, which I have not yet taken, that gives you an AWS cert, which I'm always advocating, get at least 1 cloud cert. Any cloud, just the cloud of your choice. And then if you're going to get a DevOps one, the AWS DevOps one is teaching you their tooling in addition to DevOps concepts, right? So it's expecting you to have both. So I feel like it's kind of you get 2 for 1. It's not that expensive, right? If you go towards something like the DevOps Institute or some of these third-party ones, you may have to end up, and I'm not sure on this, but you may end up spending more money because it's going to be teaching you their curriculum and you may need to buy their curriculum. I haven't gone down any of the DevOps certificates yet, so I don't really have a solid way to recommend. I just know that some of them exist. Let me see if I can pull that up. By the way, if you just go to bret.show/DevOps, I'll put this in chat, devops.show/DevOps, or Bret.show, sorry. I don't have DevOps.show. Bret.show/DevOps. That'll take you to this, this. And if you do that, I answer a lot of these questions, and I'm trying to think if I list certifications. I'm not sure that I do. I talk about courses and training, and like roadmaps and stuff like that, but I don't think I actually. Yeah, so I see this one a lot. A lot of people talk about this one with the DevOps Institute. And they have training programs and certifications, and they have multiple certifications, and it's so there's that. And then there's AWS DevOps. There might even be an Azure one. I'm not sure. Someone probably knows in chat. That's not the certification. Yeah, AWS Certified DevOps Engineer. I only say AWS because it is still the predominant majority cloud. So if you don't know what job you're going to get, if you don't know what your company uses, or if you're going to shift companies, then just go for AWS. If you're at a company, and obviously if your company uses Azure, then you're going to want to go there and use their certs, because it's probably going to mean a lot more to your company, and they'll probably pay for it if it's on the tools that they use today, you know? So, but if I don't know what you're using, then I would just recommend AWS. Yeah, Azure DevOps. Yep. Thank you, Pawan. Yeah, so I wasn't sure if there's an Azure one. Any course recommendation for Kubernetes certs? I assume is what you're saying there. No, honestly. I mean, Mumshot Munabot, the Code Cloud people are always really good. They're actually one of my competitors. And I don't know if Tech World with Nana teaches the certification. I think she does. That might be another one. Someone probably knows in chat. My courses don't yet cover certifications, although that is something I want to do. So if I would love to add that. My original intent with Kubernetes Mastery was that it would over time grow. That's still the plan, is that it would grow to cover a lot of the third-party add-on tools and then cover the certification all in one mega course. But I don't have all the videos there yet. So I don't want to recommend you buy that, because it's not going to help you. It's going to help you with the basics, but it's not going to teach you all the things you need for the certification specifically. So if anyone's taken one of the certification courses, recommend them. One problem I've had for a long time, the time to first byte is much worse with containers versus a real VM. Yeah, I'm not sure. Are you talking about like startup? Because Container D adds it's less than Docker. Docker, I think, adds around 200 to 300 milliseconds to the startup of an app. I'm not sure. I know that Container D is way less. So let's just say 100 milliseconds to start up. If you have to download the image and then start the pod, then absolutely. The thing about Kubernetes is that it's not designed for speed from like zero of I have a node, nothing's on it, deploy. There's that inherent lag, because it's got to go to the scheduler, it's got to decide which node, it's got to tell the kubelet to create all the resources first, and then it does all that. So yes, absolutely. That's why, like, if you're spinning up, let's say you're doing functions, right? When functions and serverless are all about having quick spin up time, like, in the number of milliseconds, single milliseconds, right? So you want to lower that. That's why there are specific projects for Kubernetes to basically have warm apps running, right? Waiting in the background for a connection. So they're already sitting there ready to go, and you're not having to wait on all the lag of Kubernetes doing its thing. That was one of the things about Swarm, is Swarm was faster at basically from the time of creating a deployment or a service in Swarm to the container running and receiving a connection was always shorter in Swarm, because it had less components, right? It was one binary versus Kubernetes, which is kind of a microservice architecture, and there's all these different parts that all have to talk. But that's one, if that matters to you, that's where I think the serverless or the FAS world is really sort of improving the scenario of making sure that you've always got things running even when you don't need them, just so that they're ready for connection. But that's just me. I don't know if you have a different solution, Biker, but that's me. Yeah, Nana has multiple courses on Kubernetes and also has the DevOps bootcamp. I think she has a DevOps bootcamp as well. So I'm not sure on all the things. I did just see that she released a Golang course on YouTube. That's pretty cool. I had gotten used to it after migrating over 100 websites from CentOS VMs to Azure AKS, but just saw it again on an old site migration. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's time to first byte is like what. It's kind of like saying my app is slow. How do I speed it up? They know there's 1,000 knobs you can toggle. I don't know with Kubernetes what specifically you can do on, especially for things that are polling, like pull, not push, polling, because you've got all these different connections, right? You've got the kubelet talking to the Kubernetes API. You've got the scheduler waiting on commands from the Kubernetes API. So you've got all these different pieces, and they're all running in different binaries, probably on different hosts, all running over TCP. So there's probably an art form around having a cluster that's multi-node that's able to spin up things, if that's what you're talking about, spin up things faster. It was bad with Swarm on Docker Enterprise too. Yeah, I never really tested it on Docker Enterprise. I think the last time I really tested the spin up time was, I don't know, 4 years ago. And it was early, it was probably Kubernetes 110, right, or 1.9 or something. So I don't know if there's been anything that's improved in that area since then. Oh, it could be some networking stuff. Yeah. Yeah, like the things that I'll see in apps that cause things to delay, like when I deploy all of my Helm chart all at once, one of the things I'll see is it's sort of an eventual state kind of thing where my website has launched before my database service has launched. So what'll happen is the application will say that DNS doesn't exist yet because it hasn't been created as a service, or the service hasn't updated the DNS server in Kubernetes, and that DNS server isn't resolving that DNS address fast. And so I see stuff like that where it's kind of an art form where you might look at using Helm charts and Helm chart hooks to actually have things go in a certain order, because you have pre-install, post-install, pre-upgrade, post-upgrade. You have these ways with Helm charts that you can control order. That might help depending on what types of failures you're having. So like in the case of my scenario, I would have services start. They would not be able to resolve the DNS address because they're trying to resolve a service. Maybe it's the backend API, and the backend API isn't up yet. So that service, what would happen is, since it's not resolving the DNS, then the app itself fails the DNS lookup and it would crash the app. The app would actually just say, nope, it doesn't exist, I'm going to crash, which causes Kubernetes to have to restart the container through the kubelet. In that case, what I would probably do to improve speed is I would go into the app itself and I would create a retry if it can't find the DNS address. So if it's a specific DNS failure, what I would do is tell the app to keep retrying the DNS lookup and have maybe a back-off algorithm for so many tries, not forever, but maybe, retry once, and once every 2 seconds for 3 minutes or something like that, right? And then if it retries too many times, then fail the container. Because in that case, instead of me restarting the whole container through the kubelet every time, it's just going to do, it's a CPU cycle just inside that same pod running without restarting. So that is way more efficient than a complete pod cycling. And I would probably tune my code to do that. I would also maybe do that for database connections, where if either the database is connected, but it doesn't have the right data because maybe you're spinning up new environments all the time. This is really necessary for testing, where if you got testing infrastructure and you need to run the test as fast as possible, but all the apps are all waiting on the seed data to go into the database, and they're all trying to connect, and then they fail, and then they crash, and then they restart. I would also try to start doing Helm hooks combined with retries in all the apps. And that way, I'm controlling order with Helm hooks. Things go over here before things happen over here. And then I would then layer on top of that apps that do native retries inside. So I'm saying the same thing over and over again, but that's kind of the way I would approach it. So hopefully that helps. All right. Well, thank you everyone for showing up. And I'm, again, going to be here next week. It sounds like we've got some people interested in doing the DigitalOcean Kubernetes thing next week. So for New Year's, we get to learn a new Kubernetes solution. And I'm going to talk to my connections at Kubernetes. At DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean, by the way, if you're a fan of DigitalOcean and you want to talk about DigitalOcean, I love DigitalOcean for simple solutions. I run all my personal stuff on DigitalOcean. I run small startup business stuff on DigitalOcean. And if you haven't looked lately, they have now firewalls and multi-networks and all the kind of things that we're come to expect. But they do it in a very easy way. So it's almost like it's the simple AWS, right? So they have this new program at DigitalOcean called the Navigators. And I was lucky enough to get in to the first cohort. So you can apply to be a navigator if you're someone who wants to blog about it, talk about it. It's kind of like the Docker captains of DigitalOcean. And yeah, I'm in here somewhere. I think they have a list, the ambassador program. Yeah, so they made a post a couple days ago about all the new navigators, and somewhere they had a list of them that I'm on, but I don't know how to find that. So thank you, DigitalOcean, for doing that. Oh, here we go. Meet the Navigators. So they've got this really cool program, and they're giving us swag and resources, and we have contacts. So you can apply on their website, and yeah, that's the thing. All right, let's say goodbye. I'll be here next week. Let's see if we can make the DigitalOcean thing. Of course, if you want to know whether that's going to happen, go over to my Patreon. You can do this totally for free, and just click the join button. You don't have to pay me any money. If you click the join, then you'll get my notifications each week on what we're doing on Thursday in the live show. And then you can decide if you want to show up. We also announce what podcast episodes are launching, any new open source I've released, anything that I've created or am going to create. You'll see there in the Patreon. Just click follow right there. All right. Happy holidays, everyone. Merry Christmas. I will see you next week before the new year. Ciao.